It was late afternoon when the sun dipped low behind the crumbling apartment blocks, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow alleyways of the neighborhood. The kind of shadows that gave cover to kids who hung around in groups, looking for trouble, feeding on boredom and adrenaline. Alina knew better than to walk home this way, but the shortcut saved her 20 minutes and she was already late. Her mother would worry if she didn't get back before dark, and the last thing she wanted was another scolding about being careless. She clutched the straps of her faded blue backpack tightly, the same one she'd carried for years, the zippers a little bent, the fabric worn but sturdy. Inside were her books, some sketches she had been working on, and a small case her father had given her before he left for deployment overseas. The thought of him always made her straighten her back a little, even when she felt nervous. She didn't notice the group of boys at first, leaning against a graffiti-marked wall, their laughter echoing off the brick. It wasn't until she heard one of them mutter something sharp and mocking that she realized they were paying attention to her. Her stomach tightened and she thought about crossing the street, but before she could, one of them stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, wearing a red cap pulled low over his eyes, a smirk on his lips that said he enjoyed making others uncomfortable. "Hey, what's in the bag?" he asked casually like it was nothing. She kept walking, pretending not to hear, but the sound of footsteps behind her told her the others had peeled off the wall and were following. "Come on, don't be rude," another voice said, this one higher-pitched, mocking. "We just want to see what's so important." Her pulse quickened. She had been told again and again not to engage, not to draw attention, but the fear in her chest was quickly mixing with anger. They had no right to bother her. Still, she quickened her pace, eyes fixed on the end of the alley where light spilled from the main street. She was almost there when a hand shot out, yanking at her backpack strap so hard it jerked her backward. "Let go," she snapped, spinning around, but the boy in the red cap just grinned wider, tugging the bag off her shoulders as easily as if he'd done it 100 times before. She stumbled, caught herself and lunged forward, but two of the others closed in, blocking her path. "Relax," one of them said. "We'll give it back. Just curious." Her heart pounded in her ears as she watched them unzip the bag and dump the contents on the ground. Her notebook spilled across the concrete, sketches fluttering in the breeze, pencils clattering noisily. They laughed at the drawings, crude comments bouncing between them, but then the boy in the red cap froze. His hand had closed around the small black case buried at the bottom of the bag. Unlike the other items, it looked serious, important, out of place. He snapped it open, expecting maybe money or jewelry, something he could pocket and brag about later. But what he found instead stopped him cold. Nestled inside was a metal, round and heavy, gleaming even in the fading light. It wasn't flashy like some trinket. It carried weight, history, and meaning. The ribbon attached to it was worn but clean, the kind of ribbon that had been touched with respect more times than one could count. The laughter around him died abruptly as the boys leaned closer. For a moment the alley was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic. What is this?" one of them whispered. The red-capped boy turned it over in his hand, reading the inscription etched into the metal. His mouth tightened, his swagger evaporating. "It's a military medal," he muttered, though his voice was quieter now. Alina's breath came in quick bursts, not from fear this time but from the heavy mix of anger and pride swelling inside her. "That belonged to my father," she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "He earned it." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the boy holding the medal. "Give it back." Something shifted in their faces. The arrogance drained away, replaced by uncertainty. None of them moved at first, as if the object in his hand carried more than just metal and ribbon. It carried a weight they weren't prepared to handle. They had thought they were playing a game, but suddenly it didn't feel like one. The boy in the red cap cleared his throat, his fingers twitching as if the metal had grown hot. For the first time since she had seen him, his smirk faltered. Behind him, one of the others muttered, "Man, just give it back. That's not ours." Alina stood straighter, her chin lifting, and though she was just a girl standing in the shadows of an alley with her belongings scattered at her feet, in that moment she carried herself like someone far stronger. Her father had told her once, "Respect is not given, it's earned." As she watched the boy hesitate, she realized that even in this ugly encounter, her father's words were proving true. They had taken her backpack without a thought, but they had stopped cold at the metal no one expected. The boy in the red cap held the metal as if it might burn through his palm, the weight of it making him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. The others shuffled nervously, their earlier bravado dissolving into uneasy silence, and for the first time Alina felt the balance tilt ever so slightly in her favor. She stepped forward, never breaking eye contact, her voice sharp but calm. "That's not yours. Put it back." For a long moment he just stood there, jaw tight, eyes darting from the metal to her face and back again, as if some invisible battle was raging inside him. His friends muttered again, voices low, urging him to stop messing around. Finally, with a small grunt, he snapped the case shut and set it down carefully on the pile of her scattered belongings. But even then he didn't look at her. He looked away, suddenly fascinated by the cracks in the pavement. Alina crouched quickly, gathering her things with trembling hands, sliding the metal back into the safety of her bag. Her heart was still hammering, but there was a strange steadiness in her chest too, a kind of calm that came from knowing she had faced them and hadn't backed down. She stacked her notebooks, tucked her pencils into the side pocket, and zipped everything shut before standing tall again. The group lingered awkwardly, watching her, unsure of themselves now that the game they'd started had soured. One of the younger boys scratched the back of his neck and muttered, "We didn't know." The words were almost apologetic, but not quite, hanging in the air between them like a fragile thread. Alina's eyes flicked to him, then back to the boy in the red cap. "You don't get to know," she said firmly. "You don't get to touch what you can't respect." It wasn't something she had planned to say, but the words tumbled out anyway, sharp and clear, and as soon as she heard them she realized she meant every syllable. Her father had told her once about how metals weren't just metal. They were stories etched into something tangible, memories carried forward so people wouldn't forget. The boys shifted again, their shoulders sagging, their voices gone. They weren't laughing anymore. Without another word, she turned on her heel and started toward the light at the end of the alley, her backpack secure on her shoulders. She didn't look back, not even once, though she could feel their eyes following her. Every step she took seemed to echo louder, as if the ground itself was recognizing the moment. When she finally emerged onto the main street, the world seemed too bright, too ordinary compared to the heavy silence she had just left behind. People bustled past, cars honked, shopkeepers called out prices, and it was as though the alley and everything that had happened inside it had been swallowed whole by the city. But for her, the weight of it clung tightly, not like fear but like a memory branded into her bones. She walked quickly, not wanting to be late, but her mind was racing. She thought about the way the metal had silenced them, the way their laughter had evaporated the moment they saw it. It wasn't because they knew exactly what it was, they didn't, but they could sense it carried meaning beyond their reach. That realization made her think about her father in a new light. She had always admired him, missed him when he was away, but she hadn't understood until now how much of his presence was carried in the smallest things. That medal wasn't just his achievement, it was a piece of him, a reminder of everything he had stood for. As she turned down the familiar street toward home, she slowed her pace. Her mother would notice if she came in flustered, and she didn't want to worry her with the details of what had just happened. Instead, she rehearsed a calmer version of the truth in her head. She would say she had taken too long at school, maybe stopped to sketch for a while. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't bury the memory of that moment, the way the boys had frozen, the way something so small had shifted the entire scene. When she reached her building, the peeling paint on the front door and the faint smell of cooking drifting from the windows felt like anchors, pulling her back to the safety of home. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs heavier than she expected, and when she reached her apartment she paused for a breath before pushing the door open. Inside, her mother was setting the table, her movements brisk and efficient, but her face softened when she looked up and saw her. "You're late," her mother said, but the tone wasn't harsh, just worried. Alina smiled faintly, adjusting her bag. "Sorry? Got caught up." She slipped inside, the warmth of the room wrapping around her like a blanket. Dinner smelled good, her mother was humming softly under her breath, and for a moment everything felt normal again. But when she went to her room and closed the door behind her, she pulled the metal from the case and set it gently on her desk. The dim light from the lamp caught on the etched surface, making it gleam. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing the cool metal. "They didn't deserve to touch you," she whispered, more to herself than to the metal. For the first time in a long while, she felt like her father was right there with her, not just a memory but a presence, watching quietly, proud. And she knew deep down that what had happened today wasn't the end of it, it was only the beginning. That night Alina found it difficult to sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city drifting through the window, and her mind kept circling back to the faces of the boys in the alley. The way their laughter had died so suddenly, the way their eyes had widened at the sight of the metal, and the strange stillness that had followed. She replayed it again and again, every detail sharper than the last. For the first time she felt like she understood something about power, not the kind that came from strength or numbers, but the kind that came from meaning, from history. Her father had once told her stories of men who stood taller than they were, not because they were stronger but because they carried something greater on their shoulders. She had thought it was just a way of making old battles sound noble, but now she realized it was true. That medal wasn't just a reminder of her father, it was a reminder of everything he represented. She sat up in bed and looked at the medal resting on her desk. The dim glow from the street lamp outside gave it a soft shine, and she reached for it, holding it gently in her hands. Her fingers traced the ridges of the engraving, the worn edges of the ribbon. She imagined her father receiving it, the weight of it pressed into his palm, the sound of applause, the pride in his eyes. She whispered softly, "I wish you were here." Her voice broke slightly and she clenched her jaw, forcing the tears back. She hated crying, especially when it came to him. He had always told her to be strong, to stand tall, even when the world tried to knock her down. Putting the medal back, she crawled under the blanket, her mind finally quieting as she drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, sunlight poured into her room, waking her earlier than usual. She dressed quickly, slung her backpack over her shoulders, and hesitated before sliding the metal case into the bag again. She didn't usually carry it with her, it had always stayed safe in her drawer, but something in her gut told her to keep it close. School felt different that day. The halls buzzed with the usual chatter, lockers slamming, teachers shouting over the noise, but Alina noticed more than a few glances thrown her way. Whispers rippled in pockets as she passed, some curious, some hushed, but all directed at her. At first she thought she was imagining it, until one of her classmates leaned over during math and whispered, "Is it true? You stood up to those guys in the alley?" Alina stiffened. "Who told you that?" The girl shrugged. "Everyone's talking about it." Her cheeks flushed hot, a mix of embarrassment and unease. She hadn't wanted this to spread, but she should have known it would. Rumors moved faster than light around here, twisting and bending until they barely resembled the truth. She kept her head down, focusing on her work, but by lunch she could feel the weight of all the eyes on her. When she walked into the cafeteria, the noise dimmed slightly, just enough for her to notice. She sat at her usual table, alone, unpacked her food slowly, and tried to pretend nothing was different. But before she could take a bite, a shadow fell across the table. She looked up to see the boy in the red cap. He stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes not quite meeting hers. The chatter around them dipped again, as though the entire cafeteria was holding its breath. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice low, unsure. Alina blinked, caught off guard, but she nodded stiffly. He slid into the seat across from her, his shoulders hunched, his swagger gone. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick. Finally he cleared his throat. "About yesterday." His words trailed off as though he didn't know how to finish. She stared at him, waiting. He scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have done that. We shouldn't have. I didn't know." His voice cracked slightly and he stopped, looking down at the table. Alina studied him, searching for insincerity, but all she saw was someone struggling with something bigger than himself. She folded her arms. "You didn't need to know," she said firmly. "You just needed to respect what wasn't yours." He winced but nodded slowly, the admission of guilt written in the slump of his shoulders. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed again, students whispering and glancing over, but neither of them paid attention. For the first time, she realized that maybe the medal hadn't just silenced them because of what it was, it had forced them to see her differently too. After a long pause, he finally said, "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but there was weight in them, the kind of weight that came when pride was forced aside. She didn't smile, didn't forgive him outright, but she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that it mattered he had said it. He stood, shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and walked away. As he disappeared back into the crowd, Alina exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She didn't know what this meant for tomorrow or the day after, but she knew one thing for certain. The story of the medal wasn't done. The rest of the school day passed in a blur, but Alina could feel the atmosphere had shifted. People who had barely noticed her before now seemed to watch from the corners of their eyes, whispering behind cupped hands. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with a flicker of admiration, but there were also a few who carried resentment in their stares, like she had somehow broken an unspoken rule by refusing to stay invisible. She kept her head down, focusing on her work, but the weight of all that attention followed her from class to class. By the time the final bell rang, she felt drained, like she had spent the whole day carrying a stone on her back. She slipped out quickly, hoping to avoid any confrontation, but the red-capped boy was leaning near the gates, waiting. He didn't approach when he saw her, didn't say a word, just gave a small nod, almost like a truce offering before walking in the opposite direction. The gesture was so unexpected that she froze for a moment before continuing home. She didn't tell her mother about any of it that night. At dinner, she answered questions about her classes, smiled when she needed to, but kept the weight of what had happened locked inside. Afterward, she retreated to her room and set the medal on the desk again, staring at it while thoughts tumbled through her head. It wasn't just about yesterday anymore. It was about how quickly everything could change, how something so small could carry such power. She traced the ribbon with her fingers and wondered if her father had ever felt the same, standing in a place where people judged him not by his words but by the weight of what he carried. The following days blurred into a strange rhythm. At school, whispers followed her, and though most kids didn't speak directly, their eyes told her everything. She wasn't just the quiet girl anymore. She was the one who had stood her ground, the one who carried something none of them could claim. Even teachers seemed to treat her differently, their tones softer, their gazes more thoughtful, though they didn't mention why. It was as if the story of the alley had woven itself into the fabric of the school, reshaping how everyone saw her. She wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of her liked the respect, the space it gave her, but another part hated the attention, hated that something so personal had become rumor and story. One afternoon, while she was sketching in the library, a boy from her class approached. He was quiet, polite, and carried himself without the arrogance most of the others wore. He hesitated before speaking, his voice soft. "Is it true? About the medal?" She looked up, measuring him, then gave a small nod. He didn't press, didn't ask to see it, just said, "My uncle had one too. He never let anyone touch it. Said it wasn't just his, it was for everyone he served with." There was respect in his tone, and she felt a small warmth spread through her chest. For once, someone understood. They didn't talk long, but the exchange stayed with her. That evening when she walked home, she noticed the red-capped boy again. He was across the street this time, leaning against a lamppost, and though he didn't approach, their eyes met for a moment. His expression wasn't mocking anymore. If anything, it was thoughtful, maybe even regretful. She quickened her pace, not wanting to dwell on it, but a strange thought crept into her mind. Perhaps even he had learned something. That night she dreamed of her father. He stood tall in his uniform, the medal gleaming on his chest, and he looked at her with eyes that carried both pride and sadness. In the dream he spoke no words, but she felt the meaning all the same. Strength wasn't about silence or noise, it was about knowing when to hold your ground. She woke with tears on her cheeks but a steady calm in her chest. At breakfast, her mother glanced at her curiously. "You seem different," she said, pouring tea. Alina smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." She couldn't explain it, not fully, but she felt as though something in her had shifted. The days of hiding in the background were gone. The world had seen her, and whether she wanted it or not, she had been forced to stand taller. What mattered now was what she would do with that. As she slipped the medal back into her bag before heading to school, she whispered a silent promise to her father. "I'll carry it right. I won't let anyone forget what it means." By the time a week had passed, the incident in the alley had become more than just a rumor. It had turned into a story that seemed to grow legs of its own, whispered in hallways, passed around classrooms, reshaped with every telling. Some said Alina had fought the boys off with her fists, others claimed she had threatened them with some kind of weapon, and a few insisted she had shouted so loudly that even the shopkeepers nearby had come running. None of it was true, of course, but Alina realized quickly that the truth mattered less than the impression it left behind. People who had never spoken to her before suddenly treated her with caution, as if she carried something invisible but powerful. The strange part was she didn't feel like anything had changed inside her, yet the way the world looked at her made her wonder if it had. At home, her mother remained unaware of the details. Alina had kept the story carefully tucked away, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she didn't know how to explain what it felt like. Her mother already carried enough worry with her father away on deployment, and the last thing Alina wanted was to add more weight to her shoulders. So instead she kept quiet, spending her evenings sketching, the medal resting nearby on her desk as a silent companion. Sometimes she would pick it up and turn it over in her hands, imagining the battles her father had faced, the choices he had made, the people he had protected. She wondered if he had ever felt as unprepared as she did now, carrying responsibility she hadn't asked for. School, however, refused to let her fade back into the background. One afternoon, as she was leaving class, a teacher called her over. Mr. Levin was old, with gray hair and a voice that carried authority without needing to shout. He gestured for her to step aside, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I've been hearing things," he said, his tone careful. Alina's stomach tightened. She wasn't sure what he meant, but she kept her expression neutral. About what happened last week, he continued. I don't care about the rumors. But I do care about how you handled yourself. She blinked, unsure how to respond. He studied her for a moment before nodding. It takes a certain kind of strength to stand your ground. Don't lose that. Not everyone has it. With that, he dismissed her, leaving her standing in the hallway with her thoughts spinning. Strength. The word lingered with her all day, as though it had been carved into her mind. She didn't feel strong, she felt uncertain, heavy, and sometimes even scared, but maybe strength wasn't about feeling ready. Maybe it was about showing up anyway. That evening as she walked home, she found herself back in the alley without meaning to. The place looked smaller than she remembered, just a strip of concrete between two old walls, littered with scraps of paper and broken glass. But when she stood there, the memory came flooding back. The laughter, the grab, the metal glinting in the fading light. She closed her eyes, breathing in the silence. She thought about the boys, especially the one in the red cap. She hadn't seen him much since the cafeteria, but the look in his eyes had stayed with her. It wasn't just guilt, there had been something else there, something she couldn't quite name. Regret maybe. Or respect. She didn't know why it mattered to her, but it did. She picked up a piece of chalk from the ground, left over from some kids who had been drawing, and she wrote a single word on the wall: respect. She stared at it for a long moment before walking away, the letters glowing faintly in the dim light. At home, her mother asked her to set the table, and as they ate dinner, Alina listened to her mother talk about bills, about the neighbor's dog, about the little things that filled the day. It felt strange to sit there, smiling and nodding while holding something so much heavier inside. But when she glanced at the medal on her desk later that night, she realized that maybe that was the point. The medal didn't erase the ordinary parts of life, it existed alongside them. And maybe her strength would come from learning to carry both. Lying in bed, she thought again about her father. Somewhere far away, he was carrying his own weight, his own fears and responsibilities, and yet she imagined he would look at her now and see someone worthy of that same struggle. With that thought, she finally drifted into sleep, her dreams filled not with fear, but with a quiet kind of determination. 2 weeks later, the story of the alley had cooled into something quieter but more permanent, a kind of unspoken legend that clung to her name whether she liked it or not. People no longer whispered quite so openly, but when Alina passed, she still noticed the subtle shift in posture, the sideways glances, the way conversations paused. What had once felt like a spotlight now felt like a shadow that followed her everywhere, not loud but always present. She learned to carry it the same way she carried her backpack, with a mix of weariness and acceptance. Yet beneath it all, she could sense something else building, like a storm gathering at the edges of the horizon. It was the red-cap boy. She saw him more often now, though never close enough to speak. He lingered at the edges of places she passed, sometimes near the school gates, sometimes on the far side of the street, and once even across from the small grocery her mother frequented. He never approached, never called out, but his presence was deliberate, a silent tether that neither of them acknowledged. At first it unsettled her, made her quicken her steps, but eventually she began to wonder if it wasn't intimidation he carried but something else entirely. One afternoon, as she left the library with her bag heavy on her shoulder, she spotted him waiting at the corner. Her first instinct was to turn the other way, but before she could, he lifted his hand, not in a wave but in a kind of half-salute, awkward and uncertain. For reasons she couldn't explain, she stopped walking. He crossed the street slowly, his movements careful, as though he didn't want to spook her. When he finally reached her, he kept a few feet of distance, his eyes darting nervously. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. Alina crossed her arms, keeping her expression guarded. "About what?" He looked down, scuffing his shoe against the pavement. "That medal. I can't stop thinking about it. About how we treated you. About how wrong it was." She studied him, trying to decide if he was sincere. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something rawer, almost vulnerable. "You don't get to undo it," she said firmly. "You can't take back what you did just because you feel guilty now." He winced but nodded. "I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I want to understand. What did it mean? Why did it matter so much?" For a long moment, she considered brushing him off, walking away and leaving him in his confusion. But then she thought of her father, of the weight he carried, of the lessons he had tried to pass on. Maybe this was one of those moments where silence wasn't strength. She adjusted her backpack, then said quietly, "It's not just a medal. It's a story. My father earned it for what he did, for what he gave. It's proof that he stood for something bigger than himself. When you grabbed it, you weren't just taking from me, you were disrespecting him and everyone who ever stood beside him. His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers and she saw something shift in them. I didn't think about it like that, he admitted. I just thought it was some shiny thing. It's not shiny, she said sharply. It's heavy. You don't get to touch it unless you understand that. He swallowed hard, then nodded again. I get it now. Or at least I'm trying to. The sincerity in his voice startled her. She wasn't sure what she had expected. An excuse, a half-hearted apology, but not this raw attempt to learn. For the first time, she felt the anger she had been carrying loosen just slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something closer to release. They stood there for a moment in silence, the noise of the street around them fading into the background. Finally, he said, I just wanted to tell you, I'm done with that stuff. Messing with people, stealing, acting tough. It doesn't feel the same anymore. Not after that. Alina raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but something in his tone made her believe he meant it, at least in that moment. Good, she said simply. Because if you ever try it again, you won't just have to answer to me. His lips twitched, almost into a smile, but he caught himself and nodded seriously. Fair enough. Without another word, he stepped back, giving her space, then turned and walked away. She watched him go, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to dismiss him, to refuse to care, but another part wondered if maybe the medal had done more than protect her that day. Maybe it had changed him too. That night, as she set the medal on her desk again, she thought about the conversation, about how heavy her father's presence felt even when he was far away. She realized that carrying the medal wasn't just about remembering, it was about teaching even when she didn't mean to. She whispered softly into the quiet room, maybe that's what you wanted all along. The days moved forward with a steady rhythm, but Alina felt like she was walking on a path she hadn't chosen, one that kept unfolding ahead of her no matter how much she wanted to step off it. The medal had become more than just a keepsake now, it had turned into a kind of compass, guiding not only her but the people around her. At school, the whispers had softened, and though students still looked at her differently, it was no longer with the same raw curiosity as before. It was quieter now, more like an acknowledgement, as if they understood without needing to say anything that she carried something they couldn't. Even the teachers seemed to have shifted in subtle ways, giving her small nods of respect she didn't quite know how to handle. Still, she wasn't comfortable with all of it. Sometimes she longed for the days when she could slip unnoticed through the hallways, invisible, free of expectation. But then she would think of her father, and she knew invisibility was no longer an option. One afternoon, after classes ended, the boy in the red cap approached her again, this time without hesitation. His hands were empty, no smirk on his face, just a kind of awkward seriousness that made him look older than he was. I wanted to ask you something, he said, his voice quieter than usual. She eyed him warily. What? He hesitated, then blurted out, do you think your dad would have hated me? For what I did? The question caught her off guard. She wasn't sure how to answer immediately. She thought about her father, about the way he always tried to see people for more than just their mistakes, about the way he had taught her that respect wasn't about never failing, it was about how you rose after you fell. I don't think he would have hated you, she said carefully. But he wouldn't have respected you either. Not for what you did that day. The boy swallowed, his eyes downcast. And now? She studied him for a moment before answering. That depends on what you do from here. He nodded slowly as though turning her words over in his mind. Then, almost reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a folded piece of paper, crumpled from being handled too many times. He held it out to her. I drew this. I'm not good at it or anything, but I thought maybe you'd understand. Curious, she unfolded the paper. The lines were rough, unsteady, but she could see the effort in them. He had sketched a medal, simple and imperfect, but shaded carefully as though he had tried to capture its weight. Beneath it, in uneven handwriting, he had written one word, respect. Alina stared at it, her throat tightening. She didn't know what to say, so she folded the paper back up and handed it to him. Keep it, she said softly. It's yours. His lips parted as if he wanted to protest, but then he nodded, tucking it back into his pocket with surprising care. For the first time she saw something genuine in his eyes, something that felt like change. They stood there in silence for a moment before he finally said, thanks. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her holding the weight of the moment in her chest. That evening, when she returned home, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and Alina's heart lurched in panic. "What is it?" she asked quickly. Her mother looked up slowly, her voice trembling. "It's from your father. He's coming home." The words seemed to freeze the air in the room. Alina blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "Home? When?" "Soon," her mother whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. They didn't say the exact day, but soon. Alina's chest swelled with so many emotions at once: relief, joy, fear, hope, that she could hardly breathe. She stumbled to her room, shut the door, and pulled the medal from her bag. Holding it tightly in her hands, she whispered, "You're coming back." For so long, the medal had been the only piece of him she had, the only reminder that he was out there somewhere. Now the thought of seeing him again made her heart race. She sat on the edge of her bed, imagining the moment he would walk through the door, how it would feel to see his face, to hear his voice. But beneath the excitement, a thread of anxiety wound its way through her thoughts. Would he recognize her? Would he see how much she had changed? Would he be proud of the way she had carried his story, his medal, in his absence? She didn't know, but she promised herself she would be ready. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to smile without restraint, the weight of the medal warm against her palms. The days that followed passed in a haze of waiting, each one heavier with anticipation than the last. Alina counted them silently, marking each sunrise as if it brought her closer to the moment she had dreamed of for so long. She wore the medal every day now, not on display but close to her skin, hidden beneath her shirt where no one could see. It felt less like something to show others and more like a promise she whispered only to herself. Her mother kept the letter on the kitchen counter, folded neatly but touched so often the paper had begun to soften at the edges. Sometimes, late at night, Alina would hear her mother in the living room, reading it over and over again, as if she needed constant reassurance that the words were real. When the call finally came, it was on a Saturday morning. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, and both Alina and her mother froze, staring at it as if afraid to answer. Then her mother moved, her hand shaking as she picked it up, and Alina watched her face as she listened. Tears welled up instantly, spilling down her cheeks, and when she hung up she could only manage a whisper. "He's here. He's at the base. We can go." For a moment Alina couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then everything rushed at once. The pounding of her heart, the trembling of her hands, the wild mix of joy and fear that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something too big to contain. She grabbed her backpack without thinking, slipping the medal carefully inside, and followed her mother out the door. The drive to the base felt endless, every traffic light a cruel delay. Her mother kept gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if the force of her hands could speed the car forward. Alina stared out the window, barely noticing the streets she had walked so many times before. All she could see in her mind was her father's face, blurred by memory but sharpened by hope. When they finally pulled up to the gates, her breath caught in her throat. Families crowded together, faces shining with anticipation, children clutching handmade signs and waving small flags. The air was charged with emotion, a quiet hum of nervous energy that made every heartbeat louder. They joined the waiting crowd, and Alina's eyes scanned the horizon, desperately searching for the one figure she needed to see. The gates opened, and soldiers began to file through, their uniforms crisp, their steps steady despite the weight of months, even years, away from home. The cheers erupted, loud and unrestrained, but Alina's world narrowed to a single point as she searched each face, her chest tightening with every second that passed. Then she saw him. Taller than she remembered, leaner, his hair a little grayer at the edges, but unmistakably him. Her father. Her legs moved before she realized it, carrying her forward through the crowd, her voice breaking as she shouted, "Dad!" He turned at the sound, and in that instant everything else faded. His eyes locked on hers, widening with recognition, and then he was running too, closing the distance until she collided into his arms. The hug was fierce, desperate, filled with all the lost time they could never get back. He lifted her slightly off the ground, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe, but she didn't want to. She buried her face against his chest, inhaling the scent of him, real and solid, no longer just a memory. Her mother was there too, wrapping her arms around both of them, and for a moment the three of them stood tangled together, unshakable, unbreakable. When they finally pulled apart, her father cupped her face in his hands, studying her as if he couldn't believe how much she had grown. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Look at you. You're so strong." Alina reached into her backpack and pulled out the medal, her hands trembling as she held it up. "I kept it safe," she whispered. His eyes softened, glistening with tears as he took it from her gently, then pressed it back into her palm. "No," he said, his voice steady with pride. You carried it for me. You earned it too. She felt the truth of his words sink deep into her chest, and for the first time, the medal no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a bond, one that tied her not only to him but to everything they had endured together. Around them, other reunions unfolded, voices raised in joy, laughter and tears mingling in the air, but Alina's world was complete in that single circle of family. The boy in the red cap had once asked if her father would hate him for what he had done. Looking into her father's eyes now, Alina understood the answer more clearly than ever. Hate wasn't what her father carried. Strength, forgiveness, and an unshakable sense of respect were what defined him, and she realized those things had taken root in her too. As they walked back toward the car, her father's arm draped around her shoulders, Alina knew that life wouldn't magically become perfect again. There would still be challenges, still be days when the weight of the world pressed too heavily. But now she knew she had the strength to carry it, and not because of the medal itself, but because of everything it stood for. And when she looked up at her father, smiling through her tears, she knew without doubt that he was proud of her, not just for keeping the medal safe, but for becoming the kind of person who understood its meaning. The end.